Okay, so we're now doing part two of chapter 9, which is talking about Hollywood, TV, and the left. We just discovered how much and how infatuated the left was once again with fascism in the 20s and the early 30s. But as I mentioned in a previous video, uh, things changed when Hitler came to power. The honeymoon was over with fascism. When it became when Hollywood and the left became enamored of communism, more and more communist party groups were popping up in the United States. More and more actors and screenwriters were either joining up with this party, going to these events that they held, if not actually, becoming a member, or sympathizing with them and their ilk. And when Hitler made fascism an ugly word, they all abandoned it with the help of the media by basically running away with their tails on fire for communism or anything anti-fascist, and turning fascism into a right-wing ideology through the help of the media itself. Suddenly, fascism is right-wing. Was Variety right-wing when it was praising fascism? Was Variety right-wing when it was praising this documentary, which was about Mussolini's fight against communism? When Hollywood had a choice to make this documentary and to respond to its own documentary that it made, between the two factions, what side did Hollywood take? It took the side of fascism. And when it became untenable, it abandoned it. Doesn't matter what their past is, it's what they're doing now. Don't look at that, look at this. Forget we were this way, now we're this way. This is how they operate. And you're supposed to forget. That's on you. And if you bring it up, shame on you. If you try to remember what they were and what they did, shame on you. Now I'm going to nail this idea home once and for all. In the early 30s, there was another movie. Now, don't get me wrong, there's more than just a documentary and a movie. There's lots of them. But one specific movie called Gabriel Over the White House, which starred Walter Houston, John Huston's father, both of whom were extremely left-wing. And let me read from this book to show you in better terms what this movie was about and what it tried to portray, what it tried to convince Americans of at the time. Now, this was a talkie, so and probably before Hitler. So my guess is this movie came out in the very, very early 30s. Like many other leading Americans, the media tycoon William Randolph Hearst believed America needed a dictator. After first backing the American firster Jack Garner, he switched to FDR and claimed that he put FDR over the top at the Democratic Convention, deciding that the best way to influence FDR and the American people was via Hollywood. So Hollywood was both, if you think about it, Hollywood therefore was both a tool and the user of the tool. In this case, Hearst was the user and Hollywood was the tool. Hearst personally reworked a script based on the book Gabriel Over the White House, which became a movie of the same name starring Walter Houston as President Judd Hammond. The propagandist nature of this film cannot be exaggerated. Hammond, a Hoover-like partisan hack, Hoover being a Republican president that by this time lots of people on the left could not stand, and they basically blamed the Great Depression on him, rightly or wrongly. He became what was once a darling became the enemy. So this President Hammond is a Hoover-like partisan hack of a president, and has a car accident and is visited by the Archangel Gabriel. When he recovers, he's reborn with a religious fervor to do good for America. He fires his entire cabinet, big business lackeys all. Sound familiar today? Congress impeaches Hammond, and in response, he appears before a joint session to proclaim, "We need action, immediate and effective action." After this, he suspends Congress, assuming the temporary power to make all laws. He orders the formation of a new army of construction, answerable only to him, spends billions on one New Deal-like program after another, and nationalizes the sale and manufacture of alcohol. When he meets with resistance from gangsters, presumably in league with his political enemies, notice they tie the gangsters into the right-wingers now, he orders a military trial run by his aide-de-camp. Immediately after the trial, the gangsters are lined up against the wall of the courthouse and they're executed. Some summary execution. With that victory under his belt, Hammond goes on to bring about world peace by threatening to destroy any nation that disobeys him or reneges on its debts to America. He dies of a heart attack in the end and is eulogized as one of the greatest presidents that ever lived. One of the project's unscripted script doctors was the Democratic presidential nominee, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He took time off from his campaign to read the script and suggested several important changes that Hearst incorporated into the film. So now Hollywood is not only subject to the whims of a media mogul, it's also now pliable enough for a politician to get his hands dirty and involved. I want to send you this line to tell you how pleased I am with the changes you made in Gabriel over the White House. Roosevelt wrote a month into office. I think it is an intensely interesting picture that should do much to help. Ever since, Hollywood has been equally eager to help liberal causes and politicians. The movie Dave, for instance, a few decades ago, starring Kevin Kline as a big-hearted populist who is asked to impersonate a stricken conservative president and engineers a social conscious coup d'etat, and is merely an updating of the same premise. In other words, the bad guys are the conservatives. They align themselves with gangsters and all sorts of things. The good guys are world PC guys, but notice what happens. What does this President Hammond do when he has his epiphany? He becomes a fascist. He does everything a fascist would do. He becomes a dictator. He suspends Congress. He lines bad people up against a wall and shoots them. He makes laws by fiat. And they thought this was a good idea. And Hearst thought this was a good idea. And Roosevelt thought this was a good idea. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. Now, as I mentioned before, Hollywood was full of liberals. I mean, chock full from the word go. There's something about the stage, the camera, the lights, the attention, the gratification of entertaining other people that draws liberals like flies to dog poop. But they're not the only ones who are drawn. To be fair, obviously, there are a lot more of them now than then, but back then there was a fair amount of both conservatives and liberals in Hollywood. Now, many of you do not know who was who, and do not or can't remember who was who. By no means is this a full list, obviously, but some of the more famous liberals in Hollywood were Humphrey Bogart, for instance, and Lauren Bacall. They actually were picketers for causes that they thought were important. They were like they belonged in the 60s more than they belonged in the 30s and 40s. Myrna Loy was a huge lib. The entire Fonda family, starting with Henry. The interesting thing about Henry is he was once part of John Ford's group, a bunch of, much more conservative guys, and he was, often invited onto his boat, his ship, and little Peter and little Jane were often guests on this boat, surrounded by John Wayne and John Ford and all these other conservatives. And Henry Fonda was a good egg, even though he was a huge lib. He enjoyed the camaraderie that the other guys had. He never quite could get to that point with them because the politics often got in the way, but he got a hoot out of them. So I'll give him a little bit of props. Katharine Hepburn, huge lib. And of course Spencer Tracy, Birds of a Feather. Robert Ryan, tough guy, film noir guy, lib, right down to his toenails. John Garfield, one of the most famous liberals of all time. Judy Garland, Jane Wyman, which was the first Mrs. Reagan. Billy Wilder, enamored by all the lefties in Hollywood, like Shirley MacLaine and Jack Lemmon and a bunch of others. Big lib. Early on in her career, Lucille Ball was actually a liberal. And then she woke up and smelled the coffee and became more and more conservative as she aged. We mentioned Walter and John Huston. One would assume their progeny is also liberal. Betty Davis, famous liberal. Gregory Peck, outspoken liberal. Rod Steiger, another liberal. Charlie Chaplin, not just liberal, he was a communist. In fact, he was deported for being a communist. Sterling Hayden, card-carrying commie. Became one of the nuttiest goofballs that ever, when he was out of Hollywood. Grew his hair long, his beard long. He looked like Grizzly Adams, just spouting all sorts of wacky things. Just a complete goof. Card-carrying commie. Edward G. Robinson, as much as it pains me to say, was a liberal. Marlon Brando, and of course Barbra Streisand, and the list goes on and it goes on and it goes on. But there are also a lot of famous conservatives in Hollywood around the same time, from the 30s, 20s, maybe all the way up to, say, the 60s or 70s. Among them, of course, as I mentioned, John Wayne and John Ford. Al Jolson was a conservative. Bob Hope. In fact, Bob Hope made a lot of movies, of course, but in a couple of them, he actually made fun of Democrats in them, back when you were allowed to do something like that and still have a job. Cecil B. DeMille, big conservative. Charlton Heston, as we all know. Clark Gable was a conservative. Connie Stevens, just to throw some kind of, a woman in there, and to, someone who you wouldn't even think one way or the other, was actually a right-winger. Jimmy Stewart was conservative, or right-winger. And I say conservative, they were right-wingers. Not all the names of the liberals I gave you were liberal like radicals. A lot of them were just Democrats. A lot of these guys are not necessarily conservatives. Some of them are libertarian, and some of them are just right-wingers. So I'm not trying to portray everyone as way off on the ends of the spectrum of politics here. Jimmy Stewart, Leslie Nielsen, who was first a leading actor and later became famous for all of those comedies that he did. Ronald Reagan, we know, of course, was started out as, they like to say he was a liberal, but they're thinking in terms of old style liberal, as in classical liberal maybe, but he was a Democrat. He was not a radical. He was never a radical. They also like to say that it was Nancy Davis that made him conservative. Well, granted, she was quite conservative, maybe more than he, but they wouldn't have been that attractive unless there's something there for him. He learned it on his own. He didn't need Nancy Davis to make him or break him or change him or any of this other crap. They love to put all the crap on Nancy, but they just, their hate is evident. The transformation of Ronald Reagan was more of a disappointment with the party that he thought was more patriotic, more reasonable than it actually was becoming later on in his life. As he said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party left me. Shame on them, not him. Dick Powell was a right-winger. Efren Zimbalist Jr. was a right-winger. Ava Gabor was a right-winger. Her sister may not have been. I don't know. Fess Parker, who was famous for playing, yeah, that's good, on Disney. Davy Crockett. Or was it the other one? Anyway, Fess Parker. George Peppard was a famous conservative. Ginger Rogers. This one I love, because she's one of my favorite classic actors and gorgeous. And she was a staunch conservative. I love that. Hedda Hopper, who was, wrote about Hollywood. It's like I say, not everyone at Variety might have been, or the Hollywood Reporter might have been, but enough of them. I believe her compatriot, who I'm failing to remember her name, who came from the same hometown as Ronald Reagan, was also conservative. If I think of it, I'll say who her name is. Jack Warner, one of the moguls of Hollywood. And in fact, most of the moguls of Hollywood, at least early Hollywood, classic Hollywood, were not only conservative, a lot of them were Jewish too. Try figuring that one out today. Irving Thalberg, the boy wonder of Universal Studios, who was hired then by MGM later to prop up all of that studio, and did so quite well. In fact, the Thalberg Award is given to the most humanitarian actor in a given year. This is a conservative, a guy who thought that communism was the real danger and will be the thing that lasts, that Hitler was a fad and fascism was a fad, it would probably die out, but communism was the real danger and the real threat. I often wonder is, if he was a conservative, was his wife Norma Shearer right wing? I never thought so, but maybe. Clint Eastwood, of course. He goes back long enough to be considered classic. John Boyd, same time as Streisand in the 70s, whatnot. And of course, we know all the newer ones, Schwarzenegger, Norris, fun guys like who used to be liberals like Dennis Miller are now conservative. And, even musicians like Johnny Ramone. The late Johnny Ramone was a conservative. Probably all his brothers in the Ramones were probably liberals, but he himself a conservative. Now, they're not classical, but I threw them in because they're kind of fun to spit those out. Point is, back in the day, there was probably just as many conservatives as there were liberals. And that reflected itself in the way Hollywood conducted itself. It had liberal movies, it had conservative movies, and a lot of them were kind of in the middle. But things changed, folks, and we'll get to those changes when we get to part 3 on the next video. See you then.